Fuck this, nuts. It's just fucking hilarious. No, it's one thing I can't even cough. That's fucking. They do not want any. They don't want anyone to know about the Micmac or the Beer Talk. And they also don't want anyone to know that their little fucking race trade. Oh, they don't exist. They don't exist. So I'll get to that in a second.
They are waiting for 3M to release the other 14,000 on order. Business with Mike Epple live next. 680 News Time 26.
How much money are you saving staying at home? No commute, no daycare.
It's all auto haulers. It's all auto haulers. They got the oldest locomotive in the fucking world. Yeah, you'll hear it in a second as the train backs up again, I think. Come on, dude, just rev it up. Just once first, man. Fuck. Seriously? Seriously? Because that's on the right side of my right leg. My left foot can't hit it. Wow, now if I landed against me, how the fuck did I touch it? Wow, plastic piece of cardboard. One fucking bullshit after another. It's not hurt on my sound or some shit, right? Alright, I got this thing. What's up making that sound?
Alors, il dit, nous ne sommes que des citoyens ordinaires, des gens ordinaires. Nous ne sommes pas des enquêteurs. On a besoin de l'aide du gouvernement canadien.
Est-ce que le Canada les a appuyés depuis 5 mois?
What?
Oui, mais pas assez selon certains. Alors, c'est la raison pour laquelle il y a un groupe qui va rencontrer le ministre des Affaires étrangères, François-Philippe Champagne, la semaine prochaine pour demander des réponses. Ces familles-là veulent une enquête internationale. Ils veulent que l'Iran soit traduit devant la Cour pénale internationale si les dirigeants refusent de collaborer et ils veulent que le ministre Champagne leur donne des échéanciers, leur donne un plan de match sur ce que le Canada peut faire, va faire pour les aider. Ces familles-là ne veulent pas seulement des promesses. Voici Armin Moratab. Lui, il a perdu son frère jumeau et sa belle-sœur. Le voici.
Le gouvernement du Canada a commencé vraiment fort à début, mais ça n'a pas continué comme le début, je vous dis. Oui, il y a les choses qui ont passé comme le Covid, mais on sait que le gouvernement canadien peut faire plus que ça.
Terminons avec la réponse du gouvernement fédéral.
Alors, ce que le premier ministre dit, c'est qu'il continue de mettre de la pression et que les démarches se poursuivent. Voici Justin Trudeau.
Les boîtes noires sont censées être envoyées en France bientôt, mais l'Iran est en train d'expliquer qu'à cause de la COVID, ils n'arrivent pas à le faire. On continue de mettre de la pression parce qu'on sait qu'on a besoin de réponses. On sait qu'on a besoin de justice pour les familles qui ont perdu leurs êtres chers et on va continuer de travailler là-dessus.
Alors, à suivre, Jean-Sébastien, la semaine prochaine, une rencontre entre ces familles et le ministre François-Philippe Champagne.
Merci, Juliane.
Je vous en prie.
Notre correspondante à Toronto, Juliane Lamoureux.
Aux États-Unis.
Après des semaines de manifestations, et ça se poursuit d'ailleurs dans les rues de grandes villes américaines, le président Trump a annoncé aujourd'hui son intention de réformer certaines pratiques policières. Le décret qu'il a dévoilé à la Maison-Blanche ne va pas assez loin selon les démocrates qui sont, eux, en train de travailler sur leur propre projet de loi, ce projet de loi de réforme des pratiques policières. Voici d'abord le reportage de notre correspondant Raphaël Bouvier-Auclair à Washington.
Pour signer le décret, le président s'est entouré de représentants des forces de l'ordre.
Chokeholds will be banned, except if an officer's life is at risk.
En échange de subventions fédérales, les services de police devront mettre fin aux prises d'étranglement qui bloquent les voies respiratoires, sauf si l'agent est en danger de mort. La pratique a été vivement critiquée après la mort de George Floyd à Minneapolis le mois dernier. Les corps policiers sont aussi encouragés à créer des registres pour traquer les abus et ainsi éviter la réembauche d'agents récalcitrants. Les travailleurs sociaux pourraient aussi accompagner les policiers lors d'interventions auprès de personnes souffrant de maladies mentales. Selon le président, qui explique avoir rencontré des familles de victimes de violences policières avant son annonce, ces réformes répondent à un problème limité et non généralisé.
The small number of bad police officers, and you have them. They're very tiny. I use the word tiny. It's a very small percentage.
À son avis, il n'y a qu'un très faible nombre d'agents problématiques dans les corps policiers. Comme il l'a fait fréquemment au cours des dernières semaines, le président Trump a aussi répété l'importance de la loi et l'ordre.
Americans want law and order. They demand law and order. They may not say it. They may not be talking about it.
They may not say, hey, that's like...
Some of them don't even know that's what they want. But
Donald Trump assure que
holy
c'est une
fuck,
priorité
does that
pour
not
les
sound like a
Américains,
fucking
même s'ils ne le
acquaintance
disent pas
rapist?
ou ne le savent pas tous.
Some type of rapist.
Dans les rues de Washington, ce manifestant croit que la porte demeure ouverte à des abus causés, selon lui, par des problèmes systémiques. Le décret signé par le président Trump n'aborde pas certaines demandes entendues dans les manifestations ces dernières semaines, notamment moins d'immunité pour les policiers, mais aussi une réduction des budgets de la police qui serait redistribuée vers la communauté. Une idée formellement rejetée par Donald Trump.
While the president has finally acknowledged the need for policing reform.
Au Sénat, le leader démocrate Chuck Schumer souligne que le président reconnaît enfin le besoin de réformer certaines pratiques policières. Mais il croit que son décret, qui encourage mais n'impose pas de nouvelles politiques, ne va pas assez loin.
Now is the moment for real, lasting, comprehensive change.
Selon lui, il faut de vrais changements qui perdureront. Pendant qu'à Washington, démocrates et républicains travaillent séparément sur des projets de loi, certaines villes à travers le pays n'attendent pas de voir si les élus trouveront un terrain d'entente pour agir. C'est entre autres le cas à New York et Atlanta, où des réformes ont été annoncées. au cours des derniers jours.
C'était un reportage de notre correspondant Raphaël Bouvier-Auclair qu'on retrouve dans la capitale américaine où visiblement, Raphaël, plusieurs dossiers occupent jour après jour le président Trump. On apprend ce soir que son administration poursuit l'ancien conseiller à la sécurité nationale John Bolton.
Oui, souvenez-vous, Jean-Sébastien, il y a quelques mois, ça pourrait paraître des années compte tenu de tout ce qui s'est passé depuis, M. Bolton, qui était donc l'ancien conseiller à la sécurité nationale, avait laissé entendre avoir été témoin direct de la demande du président Trump au président ukrainien d'enquêter sur son adversaire politique, Joe Biden. Tout ça, c'est évidemment l'affaire qui s'est retrouvée au cœur du procès en destitution de M. Trump. Les démocrates avaient tenté à l'époque, souvenez-vous, sans succès, de faire témoigner M. Bolton dans le cadre de ce procès. On savait déjà à ce moment-là qu'il préparait un livre dans lequel il entendait revenir sur son mandat au sein de l'administration Trump. Ce livre-là, tant attendu, doit paraître mardi prochain. Or, l'administration s'oppose à sa publication et décide donc de traîner cet ancien employé devant les tribunaux, affirmant qu'il y a eu bris de contrat et que le livre contient des informations qui sont classifiées. On suivra tout cela de près, Jean-Sébastien, compte tenu évidemment des répercussions possibles que ça pourrait avoir politiquement. Est-ce que l'administration va réussir à empêcher ce livre d'atteindre les tablettes? Il y a en tout cas une journaliste de CNN qui rapportait cet après-midi que les copies sont déjà arrivées dans les entrepôts des librairies et M. Bolton a déjà enregistré une entrevue qui doit être diffusée dimanche soir sur les ondes de ABC News, donc avant la publication de son livre.
Il y en a beaucoup, des livres. Il y en a un écrit, très critique, semble-t-il, qui s'en vient cet été, écrit par une nièce de Donald Trump.
Nièce de M. Trump, oui.
Sur Melania Trump, sa femme, The Art of Her Deal. Biographie non autorisée, c'est ce qu'on comprend. Ouais. Alors, il y en a
source d'inspiration pour de nombreux auteurs et journalistes aux États-Unis.
Il y en a aussi écrit par des partisans de Donald Trump, bien sûr, dans les deux camps. Merci beaucoup, Raphaël.
Au revoir.
Notre correspondant à Washington, Raphaël Bouvier-Auclair. Maintenant, on parlait avec Raphaël juste avant ça de réformer les pratiques policières, mais qu'en est-il de la formation des policiers? En quoi consiste-t-elle cette formation et qui peut devenir policier aux États-Unis? C'est ce à quoi s'est intéressée notre journaliste Dorothée Giroux. Alors, commençons par ça. Quels sont les prérequis pour exercer cette fonction aux États-Unis?
Il y a 3 grands prérequis. D'abord, détenir un diplôme d'études secondaires, avoir 21 ans ou plus et être un citoyen américain. Il y a des examens d'admission à passer et les tests psychologiques font aussi partie de ces examens-là. Les candidats doivent aussi réussir les entrevues d'embauche et à partir de ce moment-là, il y a 2 possibilités, soit être embauché et s'inscrire à une académie de police choisie par le corps policier qui a embauché le candidat, ou d'autres préfèrent fréquenter l'académie de police d'abord et ensuite, tout de suite après le secondaire, et se faire embaucher ensuite par un service de police. Il y a aussi des formations universitaires dans le domaine de la justice qui sont privilégiées par certains, ceux entre autres qui voudraient par exemple travailler pour une agence fédérale.
Welcome to Mi'kmaq Matters, a podcast about the Mi'kmaq people and the Halibu First Nation. I'm Glenn Wheeler.
En académie et certainement pas dans un service de police, quoique si le candidat a déjà été reconnu coupable de violence conjugale, alors poursuit un état d'éligibilité, ça fait
Like, seriously, why does it have to be a pixel wide? Are you fucking joking?
November 16th at 6 p.m. for our special live broadcast on Mi'kmaq Matters. Details later in the show. Welcome to Mi'kmaq Matters, a podcast about the Mi'kmaq people and the Halibu First Nation. I'm Glenn Wheeler. Looking forward to seeing you in Corner Brook on November 16th at 6 p.m. for our special live broadcast of Mi'kmaq Matters. Details later in the show. This week, DNA study raises new questions about the origins of the Beothuk. It was always assumed that the Beothuk were descendants of the Maritime Archaic peoples. Starting about 7000 BC, the Maritime Archaic settled in locations from what is now known as Labrador to the state of Maine, but such is not the case. The DNA study looked at the bones and teeth of 74 individuals, including 19 Beothuk, 53 Maritime Archaic, and 2 Paleo-Eskimo. Though they lived in the same geographic territory, there was very little genetic overlap between the groups, which raises the question, where did the Beothuk come from?
Hold on. That wasn't
We
that
have two
many,
guests
eh?
this week.
Hold on,
Later,
hold on.
we'll
How
hear
many
from Chief
fucking-
Mazel Joe questions about the origins of the Beothuk. It was always assumed that the Beothuk were descendants of the Maritime Archaic peoples. Starting in about 7000 BC, the Maritime Archaic settled in locations from what is now known as Labrador to the state of Maine, but such is not the case. The DNA study looked at the bones and teeth of 74 individuals, including 19 Beothuk, 53 Maritime Archaic, and 2 Paleo-Eskimo. Though they lived in the same geographic territory, there was very little genetic overlap between the groups, which raises the question, where did the Beothuk come from? We have two guests this week. Later, we'll hear from Chief Mazel Joe of the Meobaga First Nation in Conn River. For the chief, the surprising results of the study are an impetus to get on with another DNA project into whether Mi'kmaq people carry traces of Beothuk ancestry. But first, Anna Duggan, a researcher at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. I asked her about the process and why she and her colleagues were surprised by the survey results. The current research involved mitochondrial DNA, which are passed from mother to children. She says future research might involve the nuclear genome, a wider array of DNA material, and it might involve samples of people who are still alive.
In essence, the process would be that after a collaborator from an archaeology department or the museum has identified a bone or tooth as belonging to an individual from a particular population of interest, and it would be sent to us, and we would then remove a very, very tiny portion of that. So, a collaborator might just send us one tooth while they have an entire skeletal remain, and then from that tooth, we'll use a drill to just cut off one of the roots of the teeth. If it was a bone, we would try and look for an area that was maybe already damaged so that we're not really adding any extra damage. And then if we couldn't find one, just try and find a place that's relatively inconspicuous. And this is very, very small amounts that we're drilling out. So we're not crushing up entire bones or entire teeth. We're looking at fractions of 1 gram of material.
I guess the most notable outcome of your research is that there was no connection between the Maritime Archaic people and the Beothuk, and this sort of goes against our assumptions that we had that because these people lived in the same area, they would be connected. And I gather that was also surprising for the researchers, that you did not expect that would be the one of the findings of the research.
So I think we didn't expect that the Maritime Archaic were going to be the direct ancestors of the Beothuk. However, what was surprising was how far back in time it was suggested that this common ancestral population must have been. So we estimated that the Maritime Archaic and the Beothuk, again, just from this maternal mitochondrial perspective, probably hadn't shared a common source for 10,000 years or more. If we were to look at the nuclear genome, given that it's much larger and it essentially contains contributions from many more individuals, right, with exponentially growing each generation you go back with parents and grandparents, et cetera, that might have a completely different story. But at the moment, it certainly looks like at least the maternal contributions for the Maritime Archaic and the Beothuk were quite distinct, and that they had probably been separate for quite a long time.
Why we would assume that there would be more of a connection between the Maritime Archaic and the Beothuk?
My own presumption, at least, would have been that if we're looking at two populations that were occupying the same geographic space, though admittedly with 1,000 or more years in the middle, that they might have had some other source population that was closer by, both geographically and temporally, so through time and space, sort of. And so I think what this research suggests is that even though we maybe didn't think that the Maritime Archaic would have been the exact ancestors of the Beothuk, that maybe they had both come from some source population that was somewhere on the east coast of the continent, and what we essentially saw was just two successive waves from this source population onto the island through time. But our findings suggest that this wasn't the case, right? So it's suggesting that that common source population was actually 10,000 or more years in the past.
What would you think the future research interest be in carrying on this research into the Maritime Archaic and the Beothuk? What would be the next phase in the research?
So there's a couple of different directions that this research can go. So perhaps the most natural next step is to continue the project, but rather than just looking at the mitochondrial genome, to expand it and look at the nuclear genome, so the much larger genome. That, of course, has a lot more information in it, would take a lot more time, a lot more work, but it also is something that we would want to go back to the indigenous populations of the province now and ask them once again, are you comfortable, are you supportive of us continuing this work of extrapolating further into this history? Beyond that, we could also look at contemporary populations to try and draw any links between these two populations and the current inhabitants of the province. But again, that would need full support,
this is a very sensitive topic even now.
And a lot of discussions, honestly, about what genetic research means for an individual or a group, and lots of concerns about potential privacy and what that information could mean and where it would be stored. So I think that's a step further down the road for sure, but a direction it could certainly go in.
Anna Duggan of McMaster University. Chief Mazel Joe of the Nealbegag First Nation was on hand for the release of the research findings earlier this month. Nealbegag, Halibut, and other indigenous communities on the island and in Labrador approved the research protocol. The chief has been a long-time champion of research into Beothuk and Mi'kmaq history, and Anna Duggan of McMaster University. Chief Mazel Joe of the Nealbegag First Nation was on hand for the release of the research findings earlier this month. Nealbegag, Halibut, and other indigenous communities on the island and in Labrador approved the research protocol. The chief has been a long-time champion of research into Beothuk and Mi'kmaq history and the possible links between them. He has called for the return of the remains of two Beothuk people held at the National Museum of Scotland. When I caught up with the chief last week, he was on his way to Moncton, New Brunswick for a meeting of Atlantic chiefs. On the way back, he was planning to meet someone who may have information about another piece of the Beothuk story, that some may have left the island and intermarried with Mi'kmaq people on the mainland. Chief Joe says he too was surprised by the study results. He says he'd like to use DNA research to get to the bottom of the other Beothuk question, whether their genetic ancestry lives on in Mi'kmaq people.
Definitely surprised that what came back was that the Beothuk had no connections to anyone in Newfoundland. We've always been told by scholars that it was
zero DNA. So
we were all related to Maritime Archaic. Now that's changed. So for me, we believed all those years by scholars who knew all this stuff, that there was a connection to from us.
Who told them was us?
All the people in Atlantic Canada was related to the Maritime Archaic, but that's not so according to the latest genetic study.
And you've maintained that there was intermarriage between the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk.
Absolutely, and I'm meeting a man back in Nova Scotia on the way back that his great grandfather was a Beothuk or a direct link to a Beothuk through intermarriage.
Yes. So and the paper makes clear that this research doesn't necessarily contradict that the theory that there's connections between the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. They say clearly that is to be further researched.
Well, I welcome that research. But, I certainly think that we all need to get on this one and get it done. I know it's going to cost a lot of money, but I think it's something that's necessary that need to be done.
Are you going to have some ongoing involvement with these researchers on the next stages of the research?
Don't fucking talk shit.
Well, right now we are involved in the sense that we're trying to find dollars to do some testing in Conne River. Whether or not we can find the dollars and where we're going to find the dollars to do it. And that's the next step that we've got to take. And that means getting involved with the Mi'kmaq and the kind of work that they're doing too as well. But of course, for me, this also leads into trying to bring the remains back from Scotland too as well.
Yes. So what is the research that you want to do in Conne River?
We just want to do the DNA testing and make sure that it's got no political gain for me beyond making sure that there is a connection or not. And if not, that's so be it. But at least we'll know. And I'm not looking for anything beyond that.
Finding out,
so
after
this research that you want to do in Conne River is to try and answer the question about whether there's any genetic link between Mi'kmaq and Beothuk.
Absolutely. And the follow-on meeting in Nova Scotia, I'm going to see if it can convince him to get some testing done too as well.
And what and this man, what research has he done about this?
Well, this is a whole history that I got from friends of mine in Nova Scotia, and I know the man. And his great-grandfather came from Newfoundland. Great-great-grandfather, whoever it was, and he was a Beothuk man. So I need to talk to him and see what kind of a story he's got, and then try and convince him to do the DNA testing.
Yes. Of course, you probably know the Frank Speck book that came out in the 1920s, I think it was, and the people he talked to at that time, Mi'kmaq people were telling him that there were connections between the Beothuk. So that story goes back a long time.
Yeah, the whole history has always been that there was a connection between our people and the Beothuk. And, there was intermarriage, there was stealing away from the course on one side and the other. And at one time there was a peaceful,
I can feel that one in my bones.
Community along the West Coast, and that got broke up over time. But anyway, we need to look at the DNA and see exactly who we're connected to, if anybody, except the other people, the Mi'kmaq people on the mainland. And if we're connected to the Beothuk people, even better.
Yes. So, and how do you do that research? Do you get the money yourselves and hire people to do the research?
Yeah, we would find our own money, and we would hire people with good qualifications to have that done.
How long does that take? Does that take a year or two, or is it even more long range than that?
Well, possibly it's going to take a year or two. I don't know until we actually sit down and talk to the people that we're going to get out has to have to do this for us.
Chief Mazel Joe. Before we go, details about our special live event on November 16th, which you can attend in person or catch on Bay of Islands Radio. We're less than a year away from elections for Chief and Council of the Qalipu. It seems the perfect time to reflect on the current state of Mi'kmaq life in Newfoundland. Identity, division, addiction. But the positive also, there's a real cultural reawakening happening. How do we harness that? Join Frank Skierd, Glenwood Ward Councillor for Qalipu, Suzanne Berry, former president of the Newfoundland Aboriginal Women's Network, and Charles Pender, former mayor of Corner Brook. It takes place in the atrium of the Arts and Science Building at Grenfell. Please arrive no later than 5:45 p.m. for the 6 p.m. live broadcast, November 16th. And that's it for the show. Thanks to Allison Baker for assistance here in the studio. Celebration Time, used with the permission of Mi'kmaq artist Marcus Goss. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook, facebook.com/Mi'kmaq Matters. Listen on SoundCloud or iTunes. Tune in on Bay of Islands Radio, BOIR.ca, on Thursday at 6 p.m. And coming soon to 100.1 FM in Corner Brook and the Bay of Islands. And in North Point and Rocky Harbour. Listen on the Voice of Bombay, Tuesday at 2 p.m. 95.9 and 98.1 FM. I'm Glenn Wheeler. Till next time.
Wow, watch me get my 3 strikes in a row of this video. The fuck? Jesus Christ.
Welcome to Mi'kmaq Matters, a podcast about the Mi'kmaq people and the Qalipu First Nation. I'm Glenn Wheeler. The Beothuk shared what is now known as Newfoundland with the Mi'kmaq people. Beothuk blood may flow in the blood of Mi'kmaq people, some people think.
On one island, you think?
And now the remains of Damastawit and Nonasabasut were on their way back from Scotland, where they've been in storage for 200 years. Damastawit was kidnapped by settlers in 1819. Nonasabasut was killed trying to rescue her. The remains were sent overseas by William Cormack. But where is home? The Rooms in St. John's has been proposed as the final resting site. But would putting the remains on display far away from their land be the dignified thing to do? Would it not be better to lay them to rest on their land, somewhere near the Exports River? Those are the questions waiting for us. Scott Sims is the MP for Costa Bay's Central.
Everywhere I go is Mi'kmaq, wherever they are. You don't understand how we roll.
Notre Dame, which includes traditional Beothuk territory. I asked him about the complicated process for the return of human remains, and about the perhaps even more difficult decisions to be made once we have them back.
Lately, there's been attention on the return of human remains as a big part of reconciliation, not just here in Canada, but also around the world. And with the Indigenous rights being entrenched through United Nations, it is incumbent upon us to seek out not so much artifacts, but obviously human remains and the repatriation thereof. So when we contacted Scotland some time ago about doing this, they researched it, they looked into how it was possible. Originally, there was a letter from the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador officially requesting, but of course, when you deal with this sort of thing between nations, it has to be between nations. So we had to go to the Government of Canada through the Department of Canadian Heritage, and by extension, we had to deal with the Canadian Museum of History. So the Canadian Museum of History, on behalf of the Government of Canada, will accept the remains, and then we work to transfer the remains from the federal government to the provincial government, and then what we do then is still we're discussing where we go from there.
And how are you involved as MP? Obviously, you're an MP for the area where the Beothuk territory, we may call it. Is that your involvement?
For me, it started over 10 years ago when we started putting up plaques for. There are basically 3 very important Beothuk individuals. There's Nanapasuzit, who and his wife Damastawit. She was later captured during the incident. Her husband, Nanapasuzit, was murdered, and Damastawit was captured by the settlers there, and she was renamed Mary March. In a very crude way, what they did was they gave her an English name, and her last name was the month that she was captured in. It was a common practice that they would do that, and so there was. But I mean, obviously now I call her Damastawit, which is her real name, and those are the 2 individuals whose remains that we are repatriating. The other one is their niece. It was Shannon Vidit, and Shannon Vidit was the last known Beothuk to survive. She died in 1829 in St. John's. So we were putting plaques up for these three individuals, commemorating the life of Shannon Bennett, who had a lot to give. Basically, she told
British subjects,
how they lived off the land, how they lived in and around the coast of Newfoundland.
The territory, when they call it, is that your involvement?
For me, it started over 10 years ago when we started putting up plaques for. There are basically three very important Beothuk individuals. There's Nana Basuzit, and his wife Damazduit. She was later captured during the incident. Her husband, Nana Basuzit, was murdered, and Damazduit was captured by the settlers there, and she was renamed Mary March. In a very crude way, what they did was they gave her an English name, and her last name was the month that she was captured in. It was a common practice that they would do that. And so there was, but I mean, obviously now I call her Damazduit, which is her real name. And those are the two individuals whose remains that we are repatriating. The other one is their niece, it was Shannon Bennett. And Shannon Bennett was the last known Beothuk to survive. She died in 1829 in St. John's. So we were putting plaques up for these three individuals, commemorating the life of Shannon Bennett, who had a lot to give. Basically, she told us the most about Beothuk culture, and also she told the story of her aunt and uncle who were captured, and Nana Basuzit, who was murdered, her uncle. When we were putting up these plaques, we were doing the research. We were talking about their lives, how they lived off the land, how they lived in and around the coast of Newfoundland, during the winter retreating back to the interior of Newfoundland, around Red Indian Lake. And in doing so, I discovered, to my amazement, that their remains, which I thought were buried near Red Indian Lake, certainly for Nana Basuzit, who was murdered there, I thought they were there, but apparently they had been taken by Cormac the explorer back towards Scotland. Now, William Cormac was a strong academic, so there's been some discussion of why would he do that, and I guess what he wanted to do is he wanted to take it back to his home of Scotland for study. I don't think it was any more nefarious than that, just for the sake of the study, although the fact that he didn't have a plan to return them was disappointing. Nevertheless, there they were for 200 years, and I was fascinated by this. I had no idea. Then I had come to discover that not only were they there, but they were kept they weren't really on display. They were put in the back room. I then met Chief Missel Joe of Conn River, Maldikic First Nation, and that is in the south of Newfoundland, and it's the only land reserve we have on the island. And he mentioned to me he was traveling to Scotland to do a ceremony with the remains, which inspired me 100-fold beyond what I had already known. And when he was telling me this and how he would do it and how he would speak to the university, or to the museum rather, he said to me, he said, well, my goal is to bring the remains home, which to me sounded, okay, that makes sense. So why hasn't this been done? So now we're looking at, in a few years, it would be 200 years.
Why do you think it's taken this long?
Well, I think we're partly to blame because we never really had a movement to get it going. So let me just say, when there were two things that crossed my mind at the time, two emotions I had, which was number one, this is exciting that we can bring these remains back to their own homeland and the unceded territory of which they belong to. But also, I was shocked, surprised, like, how has this gone on so long? And we just never made the request or never thought of doing this. And, for me, there was a question around 2009, 2010. As we got into 2011, 12, and I had more discussions with Chief Joe, I realized, we really need to make a special effort. So we made requests to our own government, and then when I saw within the UN Declaration of the Rights of the Indigenous, there is a section in there that talks about the repatriation of human remains. And I thought, this is it. This is it right here. It's in black and white. The leaders of the world acknowledge that the remains that are there, and they're not, buried in their homeland, they need to return. they need to return, and we need to do this in a very respectful way. So, now that we have assurances that they're coming to Newfoundland and Labrador, now we have to have the discussion with the 5 Indigenous stakeholders in Newfoundland and Labrador. We also have to have a conversation with the Newfoundland and Labrador government and historians and people at the university who are experts on this to commemorate the remains in the most respectful manner that we can.
And I suppose the first question there is, how exactly will we take them back? Obviously, you'll be in a plane somehow from Scotland to Canada, but will there be some ceremony?
Oh yes, absolutely. That's my request.
Do you have any sense yet of what?
Well, this is a conversation I've had with Chief Joe. Chief Joe is hoping to be there when the remains are transferred. So we're working on that right now to see how Chief Joe can be involved.
From sickle cell.
And once that is done, then we have to see how we're going to transfer from the government of Canada back to Newfoundland and Labrador. And then, as Chief Joe said, I mean, he wants to make this a provincial issue because, for most of the time that those remains were over there in Newfoundland and Labrador we were the Dominion of Newfoundland. So it's really something. I mean, we learn about it in schools, about the legend of the Beothuk, the story of the Beothuk. Most kids know how they were called the people of the red ochre because they would put red ochre on their skin and to identify themselves. The birch bark canoe is, we know all about that. So it's not like the Beothuk is something that we have to teach our kids about. I think for me, the goal here about repatriation of the remains is to reintroduce to our kids what the Beothuk is truly about, to get a deeper understanding than the knowledge that we currently have, which is really just scratching the surface.
Now, you mentioned the 5 Indigenous stakeholders in Newfoundland. So you're talking about the 2 Mi'kmaq bands, the Inuit, and who else?
Nunavut, which is the Labrador Métis group.
How would that discussion take place? Do you think? Obviously not. Everyone has the same point of view. So, what do you see? Do you think? Obviously not. Everyone has the same point of view. So, what do you see as the process for discussion and decision making when the stakeholders got together? And would that be determined? Would that settle the matter once whatever came out of that process?
The second part of the question, I'm not sure what will be settled, but I do. My only advice to all people involved would be, let's do this in the most respectful way that we know that honors the Beothuk. I guess how would they do this? I mean, they're not here any longer for us to ask directly, obviously, but is there a way that we can do this that would respect them and their ancestors when they were here? So it certainly is. It's a spiritual engagement that all of us have, not just the 5 Indigenous groups, but for all Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. We have to explore how spiritually this would be in the best way to commemorate what the Beothuk represented as our own history.
Yes.
So I wouldn't want to presuppose anything at this point, Glenn. But only to say that we need to involve whoever wants to be involved. But by the same token, we also have to involve people who are going to make a real contribution to this. And those five stakeholder groups that I just mentioned, and the province, it's a large discussion, and there's a lot to talk about because we've been so focused on nothing happens unless these remains return to its homeland.
And of course, we've already got some, preview of one decision to be made, which is where the remains will rest. And we have Durham Corbett from Buckens, which is on Red Lake Beothuk territory, saying that would be the appropriate place. Other people saying it's the rooms in St. John's.
There's also the town of Botwood, which is probably about an hour's drive from down the myself, I live on the Exploits River, but Botwood was the town where Demasduit passed away. If you recall, she was captured and taken out of Indian Lake, but she was returned there after she was deceased. But she died in Botwood, so they also have a claim. The town of Millertown, near Humber, and they have a stake in this as well. It was actually near the town of Millertown where we did the most recent dedication to both Demasduit and Manawatusit in that area. That was with Parks Canada, and that was several years ago.
That's between one of those places in Beothuk territory and the Rooms. Do you have any view about that? A museum as opposed to territory as the final resting place?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I don't want to presuppose anything, but in saying that now, I'm going to presuppose something. I personally, I don't, being on display doesn't make me feel very comfortable. But by the same token, if the vast majority feel that's the way it should be, then I'd be reticent to say yes, but nevertheless, if that's the way it's going, again, how does one honor the memory of these two individuals who suffered so greatly at the end of their life, that we are to presuppose that they are to be there for everyone to see? I don't know. I have a struggle with that one.
It's difficult because I guess the other thing we have to take into account is if they're not at the Rooms and they're in one of these other locations, we have an issue of security.
Yeah, that is true. That's a deep consideration involving that as well. And it's not just the Rooms either. There are also two other institutions that honor the memory of the Beothuk. One would be the Beothuk Interpretation Center, which is in Boyd's Cove, which is between Lewisport and Twillingate. It's an area that they've discovered where the Beothuk set up camp quite a bit, and it's an area where you transition from the inland river areas out towards the ocean, so it's just on the edge of the ocean. The other place is in the town of Grand Falls, Windsor, which is the largest town in the area, and that's called the Mary March Museum, named after Demasduit. So there's several. So already, as you can tell, even by this conversation alone, there are so many avenues by which we have to explore.
Now, let me ask you lastly about the impact of this process on Newfoundland and our discussion about the Beothuk. Obviously, it's a good thing that the remains are coming back, but do you see that there's also a sort of what we might call a potential traumatic aspect to it, because it makes us come face to face with what happened to the Beothuk, and it might be a difficult process as well as a positive process.
Extremely. There is an education about who they were, how we celebrate how they lived along the land, and there's also the story of how a people no longer exist through the actions of the settlers there, how they lived with other tribes in the area, with other settlements, people of other races. There's also the issue of disease, which many of them died of. Shannon did it, the last known Beothuk, died of tuberculosis. So it's that too has to be explored. So there's an illumination and a celebration of who they were, but there's also a commemoration and an acknowledgement of how they suffered. And as a result, we all suffered as a people.
Scott Sims is the MP for Coastal Bay's Central Notre Dame. Before we go, we honor Elder Calvin White on being named to the Order of Canada. According to the official citation, Elder White is honored for his vital role in the preservation and revival of Indigenous culture in Newfoundland and Labrador, and for his sustained leadership and mentorship within the Qalipu Mi'kmaq First Nation. Our sincere congratulations to Elder Calvin White. Allison Baker is the technical officer of Mi'kmaq Matters. Celebration Time used with the permission of Mi'kmaq artist Marcus Goss. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, listen to Mi'kmaq Matters on Mayhem Islands Radio in Norris Point and Rocky Harbor. Tune in on the Voice of Bombay. And in St. John's, catch us on CHR. I'm Glenn Wheeler.
The Voice of Bombay. We gotta check that out at some point. So I don't know how long that is. I don't know, is that 32 minutes? It's on a loop. It should just play and play and play and play. No, of course it didn't. Of course it didn't. Now that the mouse stopped working.
Welcome to Mi'kmaq Matters, a podcast of the Mi'kmaq people and the Qalipu First Nation. I'm Glenn Wheeler.
So that was episode 88. This is 89. Our beats are really extinct.
This week, we have two items, and at first glance, they might seem unconnected. We'll be hearing about a project currently underway by Qalipu, in which stories are being collected to add to an interactive map of Newfoundland communities. Click, and you'll be able to hear the Mi'kmaq name, but also personal history related to that area. And we're speaking with Chief Mazel Joe of the Mi'kmaq First Nation as a follow-up to our coverage last week on the return from Scotland of the remains of Damastuit and Unasabasit. Some listeners referred to the Beothuk as extinct. Not so fast, says Chief Joe. There is anecdotal evidence that Beothuk people intermarried with Mi'kmaq people, and there is DNA evidence underway that may prove that connection, he says. We heard about some of that research in episode 33 of Mi'kmaq Matters. As the chief says, there is so much we don't know. That's true of the relationship between Mi'kmaq and Beothuk, but also true of our own Mi'kmaq history. For many of us, our history was hidden,
1880, they made
and many of the people who can tell us about it are now in the spirit world. That has political implications also. How are we to claim legal title to our land when so much of the history is being lost to us? We'll hear later from Nicole Travers of Qalipu First Nation, who's overseeing the story project, part of the ongoing traditional land use study. But first, Chief Mazel Joe. More than anyone, it's he who has made it possible for Damastuit and Unasabasit to make the journey back to their Beothuk homeland. But what should be an occasion for celebration has been used to underline the tragedy in the Beothuk story, the assumption that they are extinct. I asked the chief what he thinks of the extinction talk.
Well, I'm not sure that they're extinct or not. When you look at what the Mi'kmaq people are going through at this stage, when you go back so many generations, and I'm sure there are people in Newfoundland that are somehow related to the other people, how much of Beyond Quantum there is, and I'm not sure. But that's certainly from the DNA.
And we know that people, being people, there are often interconnections, relationships which produce children. And how history goes. That's just
what kind of relationships are those?
Yes. So now that the Beothuk remains are on the way back, will this put a fire under this project to do the DNA analysis? Because we've talked about it for some time, but will this be the launching pad for that project?
I don't think so. I think that's already been done and is ongoing without those two remains. As far as I understand, a group at Mon already did some work and is on work that's ongoing. So, those remains, I don't think have any bearing on that one way or the other. I don't think there's any need to take DNA from them. We already have remains in Newfoundland that's at Mon and afternoons, as I understand.
Yes. And are you aware of what that, if they have any findings from that research?
Not even that's conclusive at this stage. Again, I'm just guessing, but not conclusive at this stage.
So we're still waiting for, I guess, a more definitive answer on whether there was a relationship between Beothuk and Mi'kmaq in particular.
Well, all we have at this stage is oral issues that says very much so that there was an intermarriage between the two groups. And even in our own communities, it's well known that through oral history that there was a connection, and also connection not only with the Mi'kmaq people, but also connection with non-Aboriginal people too as well, like the Europeans, intermarried with the other people.
And I suppose in your part of the island, I guess there was more likely to be a connection between Mi'kmaq people and the Beothuk because you were kind of more or less on the same territory.
Well, not necessarily so. Again, the Aitu and Mi'kmaq people lived at one time, according to our oral history, that they all lived together on Sandy Points and on the west coast. And they were traveling from, again, going back from, as far as I think the term, from coast to coast. I mean, they went from, the Hittite Bay all the way back to as far as you can go. And at one time, I'm sure they were traveling all of that route, water route. But it was, and people went inland from the west coast and Mi'kmaq people. And also there's Bass that was, equivalent to on the west coast and intermarried with Mi'kmaq people. And used to say they intermarried with the other people too as well. There's so much work that we need to be done at this stage to find out all those things.
But chances are, when people were traveling back and forth through the country, they would happen to bond each other.
Absolutely.
On the way to, on the way to the coast or on the way inland, depending on the time of year, I suppose.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's a sort of a unwritten boundary line between the Mi'kmaq people and the Beothuk people. And at times there was fight that broke up between the two groups, which is not unheard of. People are still fighting now all over the world.
Yes.
But it's like blocking a road to your door to a grocery store. So if somebody else is on your doorstep blocking you from getting food, then there's a fight. Yes. Never happened today, modern day time. Yes. But there's not to say that there was a friendly exchange too as well. Certainly in the later years of their life in Newfoundland, that there was more of an acceptance and a need to protect by our people for them.
Chief Bazell Joe, if you go to the Qalipu website, you can find an interactive map that has the English name for dozens of communities across the island, along with the Mi'kmaq translation and pronunciation. Now, there is an extra layer of material being added to the map, stories and pictures from those places. It's meant to make the locations more vivid and to capture memories before they're forgotten. Nicole Travers is overseeing the Stories project, and she told me about it.
As I know, there was interesting information that trickled down about Mi'kmaq place names, and the individuals who were working on it at the time kind of made note of it, like, oh, this is interesting, and this is interesting, and I wonder, maybe we should start compiling the list. So then there was the Place Names project that kind of derived out of the initial land use studies.
Every fucking time, makes no sense.
With the side notes of the
baloney. We want a DNA sample, really?
And then when that project was in itself wrapped up, which is actually considered a living document. I mean, there's always room for additions and corrections, or there's room to grow, room to add, room to grow, room to correct. I mean, nobody is perfect in anything that they do, but there was an amazing amount of work put into it, and I think it's an amazing resource. Now, along with the place names, the storytelling kind of falls into that. We wanted to turn it into, or they wanted to turn it into more of an interactive map than it is now. It's currently, if you log on to it and you click on a location, you get the English place name, the Mi'kmaq spelling, then the Mi'kmaq word or the place name said with
an individual from Nova Scotia, a woman's voice, and then a local man's dialect from here in the Mi'kmaq pronunciation, and said 3 times in each recording. So what we wanted to add to it was either a picture of the location, it could have been something more recently, or a picture from years ago that maybe somebody visited or would live there, etc. If it's a picture, it could be a story, and it could be a personal story that happened to you, or maybe you used to visit there yourself. I gave an example in a previous interview that my mother used to go to Grand Lake with her father and her family, and they would go for a week or so at a time, and they'd be fishing and camping and stuff in the middle of summer in a canoe that my grandfather made. So it could be just a simple story like that. Maybe you have a bit of a tall tale that's been passed down, you know, within the community that you'd like to share with it. I guess it's more along the lines of keeping the oral tradition alive and active. Yeah.
Yes, and getting the information while we still have people who can give us the information.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So the story project has kind of evolved out of this, and people can go online and look at the map. And you say it's you can go to your place, click, and hear the and the Mi'kmaq pronunciations are done slowly too, so you can sort of pick it up. So it's very useful. So what's the response been to your request for stories? Have people been coming to you with stories?
Yes, they have. I have been contacted and sharing some information coming from areas that are quite surprising. Like on Fogo Island, there was a name that's been, I'll say, anglicized. And I never knew of it, and I've never seen it in any of the notes previously. But it's just referring to a pile of rocks in an area on Fogo Island. And I believe they call it Kalibu, but this individual that I had conversed with had said, he said he'd gone to, he had heard through the grapevine that it was a Mi'kmaq word, and it's just been anglicized. I don't think the locals know where it came from. This is what I'm receiving. So, I mean, I'm only getting it secondhand, I guess. But that's a new bit of information that I'd love to add to the map.
So the thought then is that people eventually will be able to go onto the map, the interactive map. They'll be able to click. They'll hear the name of the place in Mi'kmaq. They'll hear the Mi'kmaq pronunciation, and they'll also be able to hear a story about that place.
Yes. Like if they have a story they want to share. So if I'm talking to like yourself right now, this interview is via the phone. If you're not local, that's fine. I can contact you via the phone. We can do a recording. There's the legalities of everything. I mean, there's waivers and things that we would run through first, but you're willing to share the story that it is made public for other people to hear and listen to and learn from.
I don't think she's familiar with Is that different in Newfoundland?
Right. So if you're Burgeo, for example, you don't have to drive the Burgeo Highway to Corner Brook to tell your story.
Exactly. Yes, I'm available through email and the phone. I mean, if you're here in the local area, great, fantastic. Come in, give me a call. We'll meet up. I can come to your place, type thing. You can come to the office, and it's not limited to the West Coast, South Coast, like up the Northern Peninsula, across into Central, anywhere on the island itself.
Well, that's great. And so I guess you're coming towards the end of the project now. So how long do people have to get to you before you close it down?
Well, the project report has to be completed and submitted, so it has to be finished at the end of March. So over the next couple of weeks, I'd love to be hearing from some additional people who want to share some stories or even experiences. A little bit of information, you know. I mean, it can be something that could evolve down the road as well. So if they don't meet the deadline, I mean, we'll submit the report and we'll close the project up, but like the replacing map, I would like to feel that if somebody really wanted to share some information or had something they'd like to contribute to it, it's always going to be open.
Nicole Travers. If you have a story, you can reach Nicole at ntravers@halibut.ca. That's NTRABERS. And you can find that map at halibut.ca/community-engagement. And that's it for the show. Allison Baker is the technical producer of Mi'kmaq Matters. Celebration time is with the permission of Mi'kmaq artist Marcus Goss. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. Listen to Mi'kmaq Matters on Bay of Islands Radio. In Norris Point and Rocky Harbor, tune in on the Voice of Bombay. And in St. John's, catch us on CHMR. I'm Glenn Wheeler. Until next time.
He's saying a Newfie name without the Newfie accent. The next one's 31 minutes. The next one's after this 26, and after this 24.
Welcome to Mi'kmaq Matters, a podcast about the Mi'kmaq people, politics, land, and water. I'm Glenn Wheeler, and with me today is Don Pelling. Many of you will know Don from his work on Beothuk research in central so-called Newfoundland and beyond. And we're here this afternoon on the Exploits River in Grand Falls. And Don, I'm glad we had a chance to meet. I've heard about you over the years and your important works. I'm glad to have you here.
Thanks, Glenn. Glad to be with you.
Let's start a little bit about you. I mean, you've been at the risk of flattery, I'll say that there are very few people that know more than you about Beothuk archaeology and the research. You've been at it almost from the get-go for the late '60s, I understand.
It's true, yeah. Well, last probably 20 years, I've been working with archaeologists, and a few in particular. I've worked with Ken Reynolds, who's passed away a couple of years ago, but he had a focus like you wouldn't believe on the Beothuk culture. And for the last 10 years, I've been working with Laurie McLean. I've worked with Ingeborg Marshall, and I've worked with Dr. Fred Schwartz, and a few more of them. And we've been going around doing archaeological work, most of it on the Exploits River.
Yes. And how did you get involved in this work in the late '60s? What turned you on to Beothuk and Beothuk culture and history?
Well, I've got Mi'kmaq blood, I guess, running through my veins, and I always had an interest in it. But what sort of moved me back in the late '60s was the book, The Beothuks Are Red Indians by J.P. Howley. And I read that, and a lot of it was on the Exploits River, and I've lived on the Exploits River now for 71 years.
Right.
So that sort of stirred an interest in me, and being part native, I guess I wanted to find out more about the cultures, and certainly I pursued it. But back in the late '60s, early '70s, there was really nobody doing anything. The thing was just left out there in the open, and there wasn't a whole lot of archaeological work done until Helen Devereaux came down from McGill University in Montreal. And my friend Don Locke.
And when was that?
That was, she did a dig up there. I think it was probably 1969, 1970. She did a dig up on Indian Point. And
Indian Point is down towards Millertown.
Indian Point is right on Red Indian Lake, within about probably maybe less than 2 miles of Millertown.
Of course, we're on Mi'kmaq territory now. Grand Falls Reserve, so-called, is a Mi'kmaq town, but we're also on Beothuk territory. And Don, you were saying before that just on this lake here, there were signs of Beothuk history.
Well, yes, really big signs here, because we're in about probably 300 or 400 yards where the main Beothuk portage used to go around the Grand Falls. Obviously, anything belonging to that now is gone because there's a town going over it. But within about 400 or 500 yards where we're standing right now, was basically where the Beothuk came into the river and poured ashore around the Grand Falls.
Lately, we've been hearing a lot about Beothuk because of the impending return of the remains of Damasduit and Nanisabasut, who have been, their remains have been over in Scotland for these many years, and they're going to be brought back to Newfoundland. And in Millertown, we have the site where those remains were taken from. So, and I understand you've been on that site, and can you tell us how exact we can be in our sort of estimation of where the remains were actually taken from?
Well, there's archaeologists who believe with the raise of the water levels, in 1929 they built a dam on Red Indian Lake, right at the outfall of the Exploit River. That dam raised the water levels about somewhere between 25 and 30 feet on the lake. So there's a rationale out there that sort of indicates, and this is by archaeologists, that maybe it could be washed into the lake. And I agree with that. I don't disagree. Maybe it could be. But Indian Point wasn't lost with that raise of the water. There was still a lot left there. And I'm thinking maybe the site where Damasduit and her husband Nanisabasut was put when they were dead is a good possibility that it's still there. And in that case, personally, if those remains come back from Scotland, I would like to see them placed back at Red Indian Lake, where the cemetery site was too, or at least as close as we can come to it.
Now, this site, we know something from the Howley book about that area, and we know about the circumstances in which Damasduit and Nanisabasut were killed. Peyton, of course, was involved in the original altercation, and then what were the circumstances in which they were buried in that area? It was, I get the understanding that it wasn't necessarily a Beothuk burial site, but something pinpointed by Peyton and Buchan, who were on that expedition.
Yeah, well, what happened, if anybody knows the story of Damasduit, she was taken in 1819. There was a party from Exploit Autumn went upriver, namely Peyton, old man Peyton's party, and they went up in order to recover some of the goods that were stolen from them. And they went to Exploit River and they surprised the Beothuks up there because that was their main winter encampment up at there at Red Indian Lake. Now, at the same time, then there was a reward offered by the governor of Newfoundland at the time. I think maybe Governor Hamilton was in power at the time, of £100 for anybody who could capture a Beothuk and then bring them in St. John's. They'd load them up full of presents, send them back to their people, and they figured that that was a good way to do diplomacy.
Yes.
As far as I'm concerned, it was imbecilic. I mean, for anybody to think you could do something like that. So anyway, Peyton and his company went up the river. They discovered the Beothuks there, and Damasduit was just after having a baby. So therefore, she was in no shape to run. The rest of the group ran and sort of got away, but now they grabbed Damasduit, or Mary March, whatever you want to call her. When her husband seen what was taking place, that his wife was captured, well, he did the natural thing. He came back and tried to save her.
Yes.
What else would you do?
Yes.
And in the process, he was shot. Down the ice in Red Indian Lake, he was shot. And according to the historical record, there's a good possibility that there was another person, maybe his brother, who was shot too. Now, that didn't come out in the court case in St. John's, but nobody got a rap on the knuckles for that. I mean, here was a man trying to save his wife. Now, he was shot in the process. He died, and maybe one other. According to Shauna Dillon, when she was with Cormac later on, she indicated that Damasduit had a baby, but the baby died 2 days after she was taken. And due to the fact that it never had been a wet nurse or something like that, and the baby died. Mary March, Damasduit was with the white people for less than a year. They took her in St. John's, they loaded her up with all kinds of things, and they brought her out, Buchan brought her out on his boat and anchored in Peter's Arm, and he was going to bring her back up the river to rejoin her people with all kinds of presents and everything else that you could go with it. Before they got a chance to do it, she died of tuberculosis. So what Buchan did then, he put her in, he got the ship's carpenter to make up a casket. They put her in the casket, put her on a sled, and they towed her right from Peter's Arm right to Red Indian Lake. And when they got up there, they discovered that there was a burial hut there. And the burial hut contained her husband and one other person and maybe the remains of a child.
So these were the Beothuk people then
yes.
who had put in that burial hut.
Yes, and what Buchan did, he raised the casket in the air, built up some kind of a platform or something, and raised it in the air so that the animals couldn't get out. Then he pitched a tent over it. About a month or so, or a couple of months after that, the Beothuks came back and returned, and they took Mary March to Massachusetts, and they casket and all, and they put her in the burial hut with her husband and whoever else was there. 6 or 7 years later, when Cormac went in search of the remnant of the Beothuk, he came across the site up at Red Indian Lake, and he removed the 2 skulls, the Massachusetts skull and her husband Monossipusut, and he sent the skulls over to Scotland to his mentor, Professor Jameson. He ended up, where they're to now, in the Royal Edinburgh Museum in Scotland. Outside of that, he took a whole bunch of grave goods that was there, some birch bark baskets and drinking vessels and all kinds of stuff. I think he had a full dress of the Beothuk and arrows and all kinds of things.
Do we know where are those in the museum in Scotland also?
No, well, the birch bark containers are there. Now, they should have been repatriated with the 2 remains. But I don't think they're coming with the 2 remains. But in the meantime,
you gotta be real specific.
That's what happened. And the story of Mary March to Massachusetts is a sad story. I mean, here was a woman, and the only thing her husband was guilty of was trying to save his wife, and got shot in the process. I mean, I don't know what kind of people. Well, it was lawless times back then, so you don't expect any different, you know. But they should be put back up at Red Indian Lake. Now, as near as I can figure from Buchan's narrative, that there's somewhere between maybe a half and a quarter of a mile south of where Walford's Brook falls into the lake. I think that's where the site was, directly, basically across from Indian Point. There's an archaeologist up there now, Dr. Fred Schwartz. He's up there now, or I think he may be finished up now. He was trying to figure out where the actual site was still.
In terms of, you say that you think the appropriate place for the remains would be the burial site, but we don't know exactly where the burial site is.
Well, you can come to folks, Glenn, and the thing about it is you wouldn't reinter those into the ground.
Oh, well, okay.
I mean, what you could do up there, you could put up some kind of a maybe a concrete shrine or something, and inter it in those. And if anybody wanted to go along and pay their respects to a lost, extinct culture, there's an opportunity there to do it. And they should be put back where they came from. I mean,